want to welcome everybody to the call. My colleague, Debbie Cuffle, looks like she joined the call, and that's terrific. She's our fund and grants administrator, so she does all of our, manages all of our grant-making programs.
Jim, do you mind if I give a little introduction to you?
I'd love that, yeah.
Jim is the executive director of the Bainbridge Community Foundation, and he comes to BCF after working at a number of nonprofits in the region in a number of roles, and perhaps not surprisingly, as a result, Bainbridge Community Foundation has begun to interact with the community in a variety of ways. So in addition to helping philanthropists identify projects and organizations worthy of their support, which I think is often the bread and butter of a community foundation, BCF also donates a significant effort to building connections between the nonprofits in our community. So I want to thank Debbie and Jim for being here today.
Thank you so much, Reed. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to speak. So by a quick show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the Bainbridge Community Foundation?
Vaguely.
Okay, great. Okay, vaguely. Well, let me give you a little bit of our backstory. So the Bainbridge Community Foundation was founded in 2001 by a subcommittee of the organization that's One Call for All. One Call for All had over time received a number of what they call illiquid gifts. So those are things like the note on the barbershop on Winslow Way, paper stock certificates. They had 1 share of General Electric stock and a few shares of American Marine Bank, and the as well as a piece of landlocked property up on Wyatt Avenue. So just sort of a very hodgepodge group of things that people had donated to the organization over time, but that the organization couldn't liquidate, and that didn't have any specified entity that they were destined for. So under the leadership of 2 folks who still are around the island, Steve Davis and Ellen Spencer. Ellen was the president of the One Call for All board at the time, and Steve Davis was the chair of this committee. They conceived a plan to create a separate organization that would build a permanent pool of financial resources that organizations could apply to for grant assistance when their needs were greater than what the Red Envelope campaign could provide in a given year. So they organized then as a community foundation just about 20 years ago, and started out by liquidating all of those assets that they had, and that amounted to about $172,000. And they started what was then called the Bainbridge Island Community Endowment, and is today the Bainbridge Community Foundation. We started making grants. On day 1, we started managing donor advised funds. Donor advised funds are sort of like a philanthropic savings account that you can create at our organization, and donors can put money into it and then give it out through grants over time. So they get the immediate tax benefits of making that gift in the year that they need the deduction, but they can let the funds go out over time into different projects that they come across. And so through that process, we started in about 2005 with a competitive grant cycle. So we took some of our discretionary dollars and we went out to organizations and said, what is it that you would like to, what do you need? And they gave us an application. We reviewed those applications and prioritized where that funding would go. Year over year, that program has continued to grow. Debbie could tell us what the exact total is this year, but through the course of this year. But I will say that a big part of our COVID-19 response was opening up our grant cycle. So most of that grant cycle was running during February, March, and April. So we opened that grant cycle up, letting organizations apply for basic operating assistance and anything related to COVID needs. And this year we were able to fund a record about $507,000 into great organizations here in the community. So that's sort of a kind of a quick snippet of Bainbridge Community Foundation and who we are. Let me tell you a little bit about kind of the broader role that we play in the community. So as Reed mentioned, one of our core pieces of work is working with individuals who want to be charitable and want to maximize the way that they are charitable. So they might know of one or two organizations that they typically support. Our purview, the Community Foundation's purview, is really every organization in what we call the Bainbridge community. So those are organizations that are located here on Bainbridge Island, but they're also organizations located in the Kitsap County or even over on the Seattle side that are serving Bainbridge Island residents. So we help connect those donors with organizations and causes that they care about. And we, in that process, consider ourselves to be stewards of our local nonprofit sector. And we have created programs to help make the nonprofits on the island stronger. And some of those, that includes not only our traditional grant making programs, but also what we call capacity building, which is really just giving organizations money to help them build their inner competencies. We've started a grant making program, smaller grant making program a few years ago, where organizations can apply to when they have an internal need to create a strategic plan or create a fundraising plan or train board members and staff in a certain area. It's very much oriented toward just making their keeping their house in order, if you will. So anyway,
yeah, I would mention that the Senior Center has been fortunate to be a recipient of a couple of those grants over the years. You've helped us with figuring out how to organize our bookkeeping and let our board of directors sort of understand what their responsibilities are as fiscal agents of the organization, and helped with us building some capacity in fundraising as well. So thank you for that.
Absolutely, and we're super excited about that. I mean, I think it's really important for funders, and this is a change in the way that the philanthropic community works. Really, unfortunately, with any conversation around wealth, there tends to be an us and a them. But I think our philosophy is very much that we stand shoulder to shoulder with the organizations that we support, and we rely on them to deliver the good work that they do in this community. So we're just terribly grateful to be a part of their work. So the foundation, so just a little bit more about us. In 2005, we officially changed our name to Bainbridge Community Foundation. That helped us to sort of true up our identity a little bit. Community Foundation is recognized by the IRS. We have our own specific division of the IRS tax code, and it allows us to be, and we're very closely monitored for our activities. Every community foundation is defined really by three principles. One, they serve a geographic area or a certain type of population. Two, they understand and assess what's going on in the community and where the needs are. And three, they raise money from all sorts of sources to help fund those needs. And we're no different. So in 2005, we organized the Bainbridge Community Foundation. In 2011, Debbie and I came on board as I was the first executive director, and we were the beginning of their full-time paid staff. And then today we have about 5 staff members in total, and our assets have grown to just over $16 million today, and we've granted out in excess of $14.5 million since we've been operating. So we're really pleased. We're pleased, especially that as the foundation has continued to grow, our grant making has gotten exponentially larger. And you'll hear lots of stories in the media about foundations and the 1%, et cetera, sort of stockpiling their money in donor advised funds and other funds and not getting it out to the community. And we're super proud that that's not the case here. We very much encourage people to give, to add to the value of their fund, and then we turn around and we ask them to support the community needs in a big way. So we're really thrilled about that. So what was life like for us earlier this year? We had set out an ambitious goal. We had just brought on our 5th staff person, and our plan was to be the most planned year that the Community Foundation has ever had. We as any growing organization, have had to respond to growth and change, and doing things differently kind of midstream. But we were really excited about this being, the most planful year that we had. We had an amazingly well orchestrated, and well, not orchestrated yet, but illustrated plan. And of course, all of our lives changed on March 8th. We have 4 out of 5 of us in the office have small kids at home. So, of course, as schools and daycares closed, then so too did the Community Foundation, and we all took to working from home. But I will say that those early days of the COVID response were also some of the most meaningful work that I feel like I've been doing in years. We set to immediately kind of understand what was happening in the community. We reached out to our sort of key human and social service providers in the community, and talked to them about what needs they had. We activated what was called the Community Response Fund, which is a special fund at Bainbridge Community Foundation that is geared at putting resources to health and human service organizations that are experiencing a crisis, and making sure that we have those emergency funds. We actually keep them in cash, unlike most of our investments. Most of our things are invested, but those emergency dollars we keep in cash because we want to be able to write checks immediately. And we found, in fact, that that's what we needed to do. As soon as March hit, we began some of our earliest emergency grants to at that time to cover food, so to Helpline House, and also to cover childcare services for essential workers through the Boys and Girls Club of King County and Bainbridge Island. So we took immediately to activating those grants. And following on that, we decided to conduct a survey of island nonprofits, actually of Kitsap County-wide nonprofits. We partnered with Kitsap Community Foundation on that, to assess where organizations were, what their expected outlook for the future was, and to get a sense of where we could help them. And what we discovered in the course of that survey, and there's some information online at our website, bainbridgecf.org. If you follow to the news tab, you can see, look back at some of that information. But what we found is that there was a sort of an operating cliff that organizations were potentially going to fall off of, and that would have happened right around this time, when organizations felt like they would have exhausted their operating dollars, their discretionary operating dollars, and if more money didn't come in, then they would be in a real crisis. And so we took that information and shared it. I think that was a big that we shared it with other grant makers, and as a partial consequence to that, we also shared it with the broader community. As a partial consequence of that, we saw people really stepping up to give. Many organizations that had fundraisers in March and April, or online initiatives, those kinds of things, did very well. The Kitsap Great Give, which I think the Senior Community Center participated in, also had record giving. And of course, it was at that time that we were retooling our grant making program to ensure that we could help keep organizations floating beyond that. The good news that has come out of that, and then as a part of PPP funding, is that we conducted another survey a little bit later, after some of the payroll protection program funding as part of the State CARES Act came out. And in conducting that survey, it looks like we were able to sort of push that cliff off into 2021 for many of those organizations. So that assumption is that if things don't get better, then the point at which we see some of our organizations closing will be, fortunately, a little bit down the road.
And I'm guessing that you're starting to see that organizations are developing new skills now because we're starting to acclimate. What happened in March was, as you said about your own plan, just threw everything off the rails and you didn't really have a plan B. Certainly not one that involved no office, no infrastructure, no galas.
Right. And I imagine there are some people that are pretty excited that those galas have gone away, right? But that's right, and we've seen extraordinary examples of innovation coming out of the nonprofit sector, as well as, so we at the same time we started convening weekly and biweekly calls of different sectors. So Health and Human Service meets every other Thursday. Arts meets every Friday, and Environment meets every other Friday. And we started to just make sure that people were talking, and that that we were getting the best sort of collective thinking of all of the nonprofit leaders together as we could. And I mean, it's been extraordinary to be a partner with these terrific leaders, Reed among them, who help each other, who provide support and resources for one another, who share their concerns and their worries, and help others realize that they have real partners out there in the form of other nonprofit professionals. And we've seen innovation and collaboration coming out of those meetings as well. So we've been really grateful and excited to be a part of that. And then beyond that, so we are continuing. We've completed our grant cycle. This fall, we have an initiative a communications initiative that is with a primary purpose of getting members of the community to recognize all of the ways in which their lives are made better by the nonprofits that are in this community. And our hope is that in doing so in September and October, that when those organizations appeal for their year-end donations, that people will be sort of extra generous and ready to give to those organizations. In so many cases, obviously we don't know what the future looks like, especially in the near term. And I think that throughout this process, my strong feeling has been we just need to keep these organizations as solvent as we can to, wait out the storm. Because a lot of these organizations coming into this crisis were very, very strong. And ironically, some of the organizations that have been hit hardest were some of the strongest organizations that went into this. Generally speaking, the small nonprofit that's being managed by one part-time staff person or all volunteer staff, those organizations have generally been able to keep going in much the same way that they had in the past. But for organizations, my house borders Islandwood, right? So Islandwood, for example, laid off 60 employees, and that's a major hit to that organization. And there's only so long that you can keep those kinds of employees furloughed before they need to move on to other areas and other places. And then as you come back, the census of people that you're working with looks different. So we're working to help organizations on a number of different fronts, and help them sort of stay the course, feel like they've got resources. We try to provide as many resources, financial resources, as we can, as well as some educational resources as well. And we know that we've got a great community. We've got an incredibly resilient community, and we are going to grow and change and learn as a result of all of this stuff. And I think despite the exhaustion that comes as a sort of full-time worker and full-time parent and full-time educator now of those kids, I'm just extraordinarily grateful to be in this community that is so so thoughtful, and whenever you see, I haven't come across many people in this community who haven't been willing to help others in need, really at any point. And I think that's a really wonderful element of this place where we are.
So I want to give anybody who has a question or a comment for Jim the opportunity. All you need to do is either wave your hand or open your microphone. And I have a question about your experience both in the last 11 years here on the island as a coordinator and executive director of this enterprise that has grown and changed, and then your nonprofit experience before that. So I'm just curious about if you've seen changes in sort of the way the nonprofit community operates, either generally or here on the island in the time that that you've been in this line of work.
Oh, absolutely. So, to talk a little bit about my professional career, right out of college, I grew up in Idaho, outside Boise, and went to college at Lewis and Clark in Portland, and was a Western environmental history major, which, that's kind of a mouthful, right? What I kind of fell in love with was preservation of historic buildings. And so I returned back to Idaho, where I had more connections in that industry after school, and had a great position for a little while with the Idaho Shakespeare Festival, not related to my professional schooling at all, but then moved in to be the director of a small nonprofit called Preservation Idaho, which developed heritage education programs for fourth grade students, and also advocated for the preservation of historic communities. And in Idaho, where growth is just outrageous, it's very easy to lose that sense of place as a result of that. But cast in my early 20s as the executive director of an organization, I was definitely trial by fire, and or baptism by fire. But the work was. But I was fortunate to have been a part of a major grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, which sort of took young executive directors under their wing and put us through a 2.5 year sort of intensive national training program about nonprofit excellence and standards. And so what I come to realize, long story short, is just that the Boise, Idaho nonprofit community was very young, and not the professionalism of the nonprofit sector was not extensive. But when I worked for the Idaho Shakespeare Festival, which was my very first job out of school, I ended up their development director, running a $12 million capital campaign that was where we were working with a firm in Seattle called the Collins Group to kind of help us manage that. And I would eventually leave Idaho and come to Seattle and work for the Collins Group. And so I spent another major chunk of my career consulting to nonprofits, helping them with business planning and capital campaign planning and fundraising planning. And so we really were on the sort of leading edge of what it means to have a professional nonprofit sector. And Seattle's sector, of course, is pretty sophisticated and quite heavily resourced. And so that was the environment that I was accustomed to. Married a native islander and moved over here, and eventually came to work at the Community Foundation. And what was clear is that the amount, well, Bainbridge has a nonprofit sector that is extensive and huge per capita. It had relatively small nonprofits, and didn't have a whole lot of exposure to sort of what best methodologies help make this work successful. And so I think that was part of the spirit of our launching the capacity building program to build stronger nonprofits, because it doesn't take a whole lot of additional. I mean, if you are aware of how to operate with best practices, and you're aware of how to to do this work, you can do it easier than you would if you're just trying to figure it out all on your own. And since that time, yeah, we've definitely seen an extensive growth in the sophistication of the nonprofits here, in the amount of money that's being raised. And you can look at certain examples. The example I'll give is just the art museum, right? I think many of us who were living in the community feared that when the art museum opened its doors, there'd be a great sucking sound, and all of the small arts organizations that relied on those donor funds would just dry up, and there would be no room. And I think that it's quite the opposite, right? There's great partnerships that BIMA has with many organizations in the community, and if anything, it's helped make our nonprofit community even stronger.
That's great news, and probably not probably replicated in other parts of the nonprofit world as well.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions for Jim? I really want to thank you for spending the time and giving us an overview. This is great. It's really interesting to get a context of the work that you do, and I have myself, of course, had more up close and personal experience of the good work that you and Debbie and others in your organization do, but to be able to share that with the folks here at the Senior Center, I really appreciate.